My tree had been there for years, healthy, beautiful, and not bothering anyone. But this woman, she decided she didn't like it, and, without telling me, had someone saw it down as if she owned the world. The problem? The tree didn't fall where she wanted it to. If there was one thing I never thought would give me a headache in my life, it was a tree. Simple, beautiful, healthy, full of green leaves and with years of history in my backyard. I loved that tree. It provided shade in the summer, made my garden more beautiful, and, best of all, it had never been a problem for anyone. Well, until my neighbor decided it was a problem. This woman had moved into the neighborhood about 6 months ago, and from day one she made it clear that she liked to be in charge. She always had something to complain about. Either someone's grass was too high, or the children were making noise in the park, or a dog barked more than she considered acceptable. And apparently, her newest obsession was my tree. At first, I didn't even realize that this was a problem for her. I saw this woman look at the tree with an expression of contempt every time she walked past my house, but I thought it was all in my head. Until one day, out of the blue, she appeared at my door with that fake smile of someone who's about to talk garbage. "So, I wanted to talk to you about that tree in your yard," she said, pointing at my beloved tree as if she were denouncing a war criminal. I already felt a bomb coming. "What about it?" I asked, crossing my arms. "Well, I think it doesn't fit in with the aesthetics of the neighborhood. Besides, some leaves are falling in my yard, and that's starting to be a nuisance." I blinked a few times, processing the audacity. Do you know what else fell in her yard? Rain. Did she want to have that canceled too? I tried to remain patient because I knew that these types of people don't accept a simple no. They need to hear an explanation, as if the world revolved around their will. "Look, the tree is on my property. It's not causing any damage, and it's always been there. I don't see why I should remove it." She frowned, as if I'd said something offensive. "I just think it would be more polite of you to make a small adjustment for the good of the community." Ah, yes. Small adjustment. In this case, cutting down an entire tree just because she didn't like it. "Well, I disagree. The tree stays." She stared at me for a few seconds, clearly annoyed that I didn't give in, but, to my surprise, she didn't argue. She just smiled, in that forced way, and said, "Well, I hope you don't regret it later." And he left. I closed the door and thought about it. What did she mean by no regrets? Was she implying something? The idea that this woman would try something on her own crossed my mind, but I found it too absurd. After all, who in their right mind would take the liberty of going into someone else's yard and uprooting a tree that wasn't even theirs? Only, apparently, I underestimated the level of insanity of this neighbor, because a few days later, I woke up and my tree was simply gone. I woke up early as usual, made my coffee, and went out onto the balcony to get some fresh air. And then I got the biggest fright of my life. My tree, which had been there for years, simply wasn't there anymore. All that remained in its place was a sawn-off trunk, scattered pieces of wood, and a few leaves left on the ground. It was as if a hurricane had swept through that exact spot in the yard and taken my tree away. But it hadn't been a hurricane. It hadn't been lightning. It hadn't been anything natural. Someone had cut down my tree, and at that moment, there was only one person capable of doing such a crazy thing. My blood was already boiling when, in the midst of my shock and outrage, I heard a strange noise coming from my neighbor's house. Hurried footsteps, doors slamming, a muffled scream. That's when I realized something wasn't right. My tree was gone. But something had gone very wrong with this woman's plan, and I was going to find out what it was. I stood there, staring into the void where my tree used to be, trying to process what had happened. Someone had cut it down without my permission. That would be absurd in itself, but something that morning was even stranger. I could hear noises coming from the neighbor's house, doors slamming, rapid footsteps, and suddenly a muffled scream. My anger turned into pure curiosity. Why, if she had ordered my tree to be cut down, Did she sound so desperate? I crossed the garden and went to the sidewalk to get a better view of her house. And that's when I saw it. And my God, the scene was a masterpiece of irony. The tree? It was lying right on the roof of her house. Yes, my tree, which this woman hated so much, was now part of the structure of her house, and I had to hold back a smile. Her plan had gone horribly wrong. The roof was destroyed, broken tiles, pieces of wood scattered all over her yard, and a whole section of the treetop sticking out through the second-floor window. I stood there, admiring the scene, when she herself appeared in the doorway. And her face? A mixture of horror and despair. The woman saw me standing there and stopped. She knew I'd found out, and before she could run away or make up some excuse, I decided to get straight to the point. "Wow," I said, feigning surprise. "Looks like someone had a little trouble with the tree." She opened and closed her mouth a few times, as if trying to put words together that made sense. But the only thing that came out was, "That's an accident." Oh, right, an accident. A perfectly healthy tree that coincidentally disappeared from my yard and ended up right on top of her house. The universe had a wonderful sense of humor. I crossed my arms. "So you're telling me that this tree just decided to fall on its own, in the middle of the night, and landed exactly on your roof?" She blushed. For the first time since she'd moved into the neighborhood, she seemed at a loss for words. And I already knew exactly what had happened. After a few direct questions from me, and a lot of stuttering from her, I put the facts together. She really did have my tree cut down. She called some guy who does pruning services and said she wanted to get rid of a nuisance tree. And, of course, she didn't mention that it wasn't her tree. The man came early in the morning, when I was still asleep, and started the job. Only there was a problem. He clearly didn't know what he was doing. Cutting down a large tree isn't just a matter of sawing it down and hoping it magically falls in the right place. There are techniques. There is calculation. There is safety involved. But this guy, he just stuck the saw in and hoped for the best. And the result? The best didn't happen. The tree fell in the worst possible place. And now the woman was desperate because, as well as destroying her own house, she had committed a crime. Yes, because cutting down someone else's tree without permission is a crime. And I knew she knew that, because with every passing second, she turned paler, looking from me to the house as if she was about to faint. But I wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. "Well, good luck sorting that out," I said, giving her a little smile, "because I'm going to call the police." And her face went white. If before this woman had been red with embarrassment, now she was pale with fear. "Police?" she stammered, as if the word was something completely absurd in the situation. "Yes," I replied, picking up my cell phone. "You destroyed my property. You cut down my tree without permission. That's called a crime." She widened her eyes and took a step forward, raising her hands as if she were about to attempt some kind of negotiation. Wait! We can solve this without involving the authorities, right?" Of course. Now that he'd realized he'd screwed up his own life, he wanted an amicable settlement. "Friendly?" I laughed sarcastically. "Like when you came to demand that I cut down the tree because it didn't fit in with the neighborhood?" She opened and closed her mouth, without replying. Without further ado, I called the police in front of her. "Hello. I'd like to report a crime of destruction of property. My neighbor had a tree cut down in my yard without permission, and now it's fallen right on top of her house." The person on the other end of the line took a second to answer. They were probably trying to process the level of irony of this situation. The attendant asked me a few basic questions, and I explained everything. "We'll send a car," he said at the end. The woman heard this and panicked, and that's when the real show began. She freaked out. "This is ridiculous!" she screamed, throwing her hands up in the air. "You can't do this to me!" "Do this to her? My tree no longer exists. Its roof has become a pile of rubble, and I'm the problem?" I crossed my arms, waiting. She continued the scandal, pacing back and forth, muttering things like, "This can't be happening," and "It's just a tree." Her show went on for a good 10 minutes, until the police arrived. The officers began by asking the obvious. What happened here? The woman tried to speak first. It was an accident. I stood there with my arms crossed, waiting to see how far she would go with this lie. The policeman frowned. Okay, whose tree was it? It was his. The policeman turned to me. Sir, can you explain? That tree had been in my yard for years. She came to ask me to cut it down. I refused. Then, without my permission, she had someone cut it down in the middle of the night. The problem? It fell on her house. The woman looked like she was going to explode. He has no proof, she shouted. He's making this up because he wants to hurt me. Oh, I have no proof. You know what's wonderful? Neighbors. And guess what? 2 of them were watching the whole thing from the sidewalk. And it only took one of them to open his mouth and say, Actually, I saw the guy with the chainsaw earlier today. It wasn't him, it was someone else. I found it strange because it looked like they were cutting without anyone being there. The policeman turned to the woman on the spot. Ma'am, so you hired someone to cut down his tree? She froze. She opened and closed her mouth, trying to formulate a lie, but it was too late. Ma'am, come with us to the police station to explain yourself, said the policeman, crossing his arms. And it was at that very moment that I saw the absolute desperation in her eyes. She knew she was going to get screwed. What now? Now there was no way out. The woman started gesticulating like crazy. This can't be happening, she screamed. I was just trying to improve the neighborhood. The policeman raised his eyebrows. Cutting down a tree without permission and destroying your own house? It was an accident, she insisted. It wasn't an accident, the policeman retorted. It was negligence and trespassing. Her face went white. The scene of her getting into the car was the best part of my day. And I knew it wasn't over yet, because this woman was still going to have to pay for what she had done. The woman got into the car with no other choice. And the best part? The whole neighborhood was watching. Nothing like a good dose of public humiliation for someone who has spent months trying to boss everyone around. She was taken to give evidence, but I knew it wouldn't end there. Because now, in addition to the police on the case, I also had something else against her. A nice lawsuit, and I was going to make every penny of it. With the confusion momentarily resolved, I went back to my house and made another call, this time to my lawyer. So, I began, laughing. My neighbor cut down my tree without permission, and now her house is a pile of rubble. He couldn't believe his ears. She did what? I explained everything, and within a few minutes, we had a plan. First, I filed a formal complaint with the town hall for destruction of private property. Then, I filed a civil suit against her for damages and removal costs. Because you know what the problem was now? The tree was still there. The roof of her house was literally hugging the top of the tree, and removing it was going to cost a small fortune. But me? I wasn't going to pay anything. Let whoever caused the problem sort it out. And of course, she had her house insurance. When the insurance agents arrived to assess the damage, it was hilarious to see the look on their faces. How exactly did this happen? One of them asked, trying to understand how a whole tree had ended up there. I smiled and replied, Ask the owner of the house. She's the one who had it cut down. The insurance company wasn't happy, and she soon found out that she couldn't get a single penny for the repairs. Do you know why? Because it was her negligence. Insurance only covers unexpected accidents, not idiots who cut down trees without permission and destroy their own house. In other words, she was going to have to pay for everything out of her own pocket. After the woman was released from the police station, I thought she would at least try to keep quiet. But, to my surprise, she had the audacity to come to my door. The doorbell rang. I opened it, and there she was, with giant dark circles under her eyes and an expression of pure despair. You need to withdraw this complaint, she said, without so much as a hello. I smiled. No, she widened her eyes. But I'm already at a loss. My insurance won't cover the damage. I'll spend a fortune on repairs. And I just shrugged. It's not my problem. She stared at me as if I were a monster. You're ruining my life. Ah, that was the best part. "No, ma'am. You ruined your own life." She tried to argue. She tried to cry. She tried to play the victim. But I just shut the door in her face, because the reality was that, for the first time, she was paying for her actions. And honestly, it was more than deserved. A few weeks later, the case had taken over the entire neighborhood. The woman had to pay for the repairs out of her own pocket. She had to pay all the fees for removing the tree. And, as a final touch, she had to compensate me for the destruction of my property. Her lawyer called me to tell me that she didn't want to take the case to court because she knew she'd lose badly. In other words, she paid me without even arguing. And the best part? After all this, her house was put up for sale because she didn't want to stay in the neighborhood anymore. Maybe because now everyone knew what kind of person she was. And you know what? None of us missed her. And if you like this video, leave a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel.